Glory to Jesus Christ. You are listening to The Voice of Reason. Welcome back. This is the second installment of our brand new Epistle series that we're doing right here on the Voice of Reason YouTube channel. If you haven't seen the first episode where we go through the Epistle of St. Jude, go and check it out. We'll put a link to it down below. And then come back to this because today we're actually going through two epistles. I think it's appropriate that on the second episode we go through two epistles because they're both very short. They are each just one chapter. So we're going to go through 2nd and 3rd John. So let us begin. Once again, we are reading from the Ignatius Press Catholic Study Bible. This is beautiful. It's awesome. This is the Revised Standard Version. So let's go ahead and open up to 2nd and 3rd John, and we can see what it is that St. John has to tell us. So beginning in 2nd John, this is St. John's second epistle. We're starting in verse 1 with the salutation that says, "The elder to the elect lady and her children, whom I love in the truth, and not only I, but also all who know the truth, because of the truth which abides in us and will be with us forever. Grace, mercy, and peace will be with us from God the Father and from Jesus Christ the Father, Son, in truth and love." Now, here's the first thing that I'll point out. St. John does not identify himself in this epistle. He just calls himself the elder. He actually does the same thing as we'll see in his third epistle. He doesn't identify himself by name. So here's the question that I have for anyone that would maybe dispute the authority of the Catholic Church or any non-Catholic when it comes to the matters of the canon. Catholics and Protestants agree that 2nd and 3rd John belong in the canon, but how do you know that it comes from St. John? How do you know that it was an apostolic person that wrote these two letters? Because he doesn't address himself by name in this epistle, but we all agree that it's St. John, that it's 2nd and 3rd John. How do you know? As a Catholic, we know we can appeal to something outside of the scriptures to know, first of all, who wrote this, but also if it even belongs in the Bible or not. But for maybe a Protestant, how does a Protestant know that it was St. John who wrote these two epistles and that they even belong in the Bible? That's a serious question. Let's continue reading, where he talks about truth and love. Starting in verse 4, he says, "I rejoice greatly to find some of your children following the truth, just as we have been commanded by the Father. Now I beg you, lady, not as though I were writing you a new commandment, but the one we have had from the beginning, that we love one another. And this is love, that we follow his commandments. This is the commandment, as you have heard from the beginning, that you follow love." Now, this is very interesting because here he is saying that he's giving the commandment of Christ, which is not a new commandment, but it's one that we've had from the beginning. He says that we love one another, but he says that love means following his commandments. He says in verse 6, "This is love, that we follow his commandments. This is the commandment, as you have heard from the beginning, that you follow love." So to follow love, to love God, is to follow his commandments. So the question would be, for example, for maybe any Protestants who would hold to the Protestant doctrine of sola fide, of faith alone, the question is always, does faith alone, does that include love? Do you have to love? Is love necessary for salvific faith? Can you have faith without love? Is that possible? Is love included in faith? Because here, 2nd John says that love includes following the commandment. And how does that work with sola fide? Because he goes on to say in verse 7, "For many deceivers have gone out into the world, men who will not acknowledge the coming of Jesus Christ in the flesh. Such a one is the deceiver and the antichrist." So there's that word that is always brought up, antichrist. And here, St. John is saying that anyone who denies that Jesus Christ came in the flesh is antichrist. Continuing in verse 8, it says, "Look to yourselves, that you may not lose what you have worked for, but may win a full reward. Anyone who goes ahead and does not abide in the doctrine of Christ does not have God. He who abides in the doctrine has both the Father and the Son." Now hold on a second. Now this is wild, because right here, 2nd John, I'm going to read it again. In verse 8, it says, "Look at yourselves that you may not lose what you have worked for, but may win a full reward." Anyone who goes ahead and does not abide in the doctrine of Christ does not have God. He who abides in the doctrine has both the Father and the Son. So he is warning, much like we saw in the Epistle to St. Jude, St. John is warning them. He's saying you can lose what you've worked for, but he's saying don't lose what you've worked for. Look at yourself so that you may win a full reward. Now, again, I totally understand, again, in this series is to see if we can find, what do we find in the scriptures? What do we find in the epistles? Do we find Catholicism or do we find Protestantism? Well, Protestants, they always accuse Catholics of having a works-based salvation, of having to earn our salvation, which we don't, by the way. The Catholic Church is clear that we do not earn our salvation. You can't earn your salvation. We do not have a works-based salvation. But here, St. John, actually the language that he uses is language that I think is repugnant to the Protestant. Because he says, again, I'm just going to say it again for the third time, that you have to win a full reward. You win a full reward as if you earned it, as if you worked for it. That's kind of the language that is being used here in the Bible. So if you were to read this and you didn't know that it came from the Bible, that it came from, that it's the second epistle of St. John, you might think, oh, this is some sort of Catholic theologian or Catholic priest or something that is saying this, that you have to win a full reward. And that if you don't abide in the correct doctrine, that you don't have God. That's what the Bible is saying. So here, Second John is clear that you have to abide in the doctrine of Christ in order to have God. This is precisely why the church teaches that heresy is a sin. And heresy actually cuts you off from Christ. You cannot deny the doctrine of Jesus Christ. Doing so cuts you off from him. You have to believe in what he revealed and what he taught. And that's not something that, the Catholic Church is just being tyrannical and trying to force you to think something. It comes from the Bible. It's fascinating. But let's keep reading. In verse 10, he says, "If anyone comes to you and does not bring this doctrine, do not receive him into the house or give him any greeting. For he who greets him shares his wicked work." Now that's interesting. If anyone even receives someone who does not have the doctrine of Christ, he shares in his wicked work. That's how important this is to St. John. That we can't even greet somebody who rejects Christ, who rejects the doctrine of Christ. Anyone who rejects that Christ came in the flesh, St. John says that you can't even greet such a person. St. John took this very seriously. He takes the revelation, the deposit of faith, very seriously. That's why it's so important that we get doctrine right. And now, the end of this epistle, he gives the final greeting. In verse 12, he says, and this right here, he says, "Though I have much to write to you, I would rather not use paper and ink, but I hope to come to you and to talk with you face to face, so that our joy may be complete." Now, this right here is amazing, because he is saying, I would rather not write to you, I'd rather talk to you face to face. Now, again, when I read something like that, I can't help but to think about, Protestants who say that the Bible alone is the only authority. But St. John right here, St. John in his second epistle says, I'd rather not write to you. I would rather talk to you face to face. What was it that St. John told them face to face? What was it that he wanted to say to them that he didn't bother to write down? I know that with Protestantism, all of the emphasis is on what's written. But when you actually read what's written, it seems like the emphasis is actually more on the oral teachings, on the things that were said orally, publicly. So how can we say that the only thing that matters is what was written when there's all of these things that were not written down? Not only things that the apostles said, but even things that Jesus said that were not written down. How can we know that we don't have anything missing just if we're just going off scripture alone? So I would say that this verse right here, verse 12 of the second epistle of St. John, it challenges the idea of sola scriptura. How can sola scriptura be? When he literally says, I would rather not waste paper and ink. Wasting paper and ink, this is an inspired writing. This is an inspired writing that is in the Bible. And he's saying he would rather not waste more pen and ink. Everything that the apostles had to teach was authoritative. Everything. Not just what they wrote down. In fact, it seems like they kind of downplay, writing things down. They'd rather say things face to face. Fascinating. How do we know what he said? How do we know what he had to say? See, it's when you read things like this, when again, as a Protestant, you have no way of knowing what it was that was said. But with the Catholic paradigm, you can be assured that whatever it was that St. John had to say to them in person, that it was contained in the deposit of faith, that it was contained and it was transmitted, passed down by the church. Even if we don't know exactly precisely what it was that St. John had to say, we know that whatever it was, if it had to do with doctrine, if it had to do with the faith, it is preserved in the teachings of the church, scripture, tradition, and the magisterium. But if you don't have those things, you are left in the dark as to what was it that St. John had needed to say. And then he ends the epistle where he says, "The children of your elect sister greet you." What children? Which church? How do we even know that John wrote this? He doesn't give his own name. See, it's fascinating. Scripture is so fascinating, not just by what it says, but also even just what it doesn't say. It'll allude to things and it won't even clarify, and you're wondering, you know what? It's clear that we need something outside of the scriptures. Okay, but now let's go to the third letter of St. John, which is also just one chapter, and this is actually the shortest writing in the entire New Testament, because after reading 2nd John, now I want to read 3rd John so that I can see if we can get more information here. So again, 3rd John, and again, the salutation starting in verse 1, he says, "The elder to the beloved Gaius, whom I love in the truth." So again, he doesn't identify himself. How do we know that John wrote this? You need to appeal to something outside of Scripture to know that, first of all, who the author is, and if this is even inspired or not. But because we all agree that it's in the Bible, we know that it's inspired. How does a Protestant know? Let's read. In verse 2, he says, "Beloved, I pray that all may go well with you and that you may be in health. I know that it is well with your soul, for I greatly rejoiced when some of the brethren arrived and testified to the truth of your life, as indeed you do follow the truth. No greater joy can I have than this, to hear that my children follow the truth." What's interesting here is that St. John is calling, those that he teaches, his children. If he calls them his children, that means that he is a father to them. And we know from 1 John, we haven't read that one yet, but we'll see that in 1 John, St. John is actually calling people father. He calls himself father, he calls other people father in 1 John. And the reason that it's so important is because, in the Catholic and Orthodox churches, we call our priest father, and we get criticized by that. We get criticized for that by Protestants who have an issue with this calling our priest father. But here St. John is referring to people as his children, which makes him a spiritual father to them. And then he explicitly calls other people father in 1 John, even though, in Matthew 23, Jesus says, "Call no man father." So we always get criticized for that. But the Protestants that criticize us for calling priests father, they always leave out things like this, things like the epistles of John, or like the writings of St. Paul, where he also calls himself a father, a spiritual father to entire churches. So let's keep reading. In verse 5, he says, "Beloved, it is a loyal thing you do when you render any service to the brethren, especially to strangers, who have testified to your love before the church. You will do well to send them on their journey as befits God's service. For they have set out for his sake and have accepted nothing from the heathen. So we ought to support such men that we may be fellow workers in the truth." So what's interesting is that here, in verse 6, he mentions that these brethren, that they testify to the love of the people that St. John is writing to. They testify to their love before the church. Before the church. So what this means is that the church is visible. The church is a visible institution, that these people that St. John is speaking of can testify to the love of other Christians before the entire church. Now that's very interesting as well. How do we identify the church? See, this is something that isn't mentioned here, in St. John's 3rd epistle. It doesn't say how the church is identified. How would you be able to testify before the entire church of something? we would have to go to other places in Scripture to see how the church is identified. But the point that I'm making here is that St. John, in his third epistle, says that the church is visible. It has to be visible in order for someone to be able to testify before the church. I think of like Matthew 18. So, let's keep going. In verse 9, he says this. He says, and this is fascinating, he says, I have written something to the church, but Diotrephes, who likes to put himself first, does not acknowledge my authority. Okay, right here, that one verse, there's so much to say. So, first of all, we don't know, again, from internally from this epistle, we don't know who wrote it. We don't know that it's John writing this internally from the epistle. He doesn't give his name, but he says that he's written something to the church, but that there's somebody here in the church named Diotrephes who puts himself first, who does not acknowledge my authority. Whose authority? Who's writing this epistle? How do we know that he has authority? How do we know? Because he doesn't identify himself by name in the epistle. How do we know he has authority? How do we know that this letter, this writing that he wrote that belongs in the Bible? And what else did he write to the church? He's alluding to something else that he wrote. He's alluding to it, but we don't know what it is. Is it 2 John? We just read 2 John. Is that what he's alluding to? He doesn't tell us. We don't know. We need an outside source, outside of the scriptures, to tell us what is being referred to here. There's so much that is just not said in these epistles. So how can you go by the scriptures alone when there's actually so much that's left out? So in verse 10, he says, so if I come, I will bring up what he is doing, accusing me falsely with evil words. And not content with that, he refuses himself to welcome the brethren and also stops those who want to welcome them and puts them out of the church. So here we have an issue with somebody who's a leader in the church who is being a tyrant, and that he's excommunicating people for weird reasons, putting them out of the church. That's what it means, excommunication. Not allowing them into the church. So what's interesting here is that St. John, he alludes to his authority, but he doesn't say here in this epistle that this person that he's writing about, this Diotrephes, that he doesn't have authentic authority. He doesn't say here, oh, he can't do that. Who does he think he is? No, it seems like he's actually affirming that he has the authority to do such a thing, but he's just saying that he's abusing his authority and acting like a tyrant, because he goes on to say this. He says, beloved, do not imitate evil, but imitate good. He who does good is of God, but he who does evil has not seen God. Demetrius has testimony from everyone and from the truth itself. I testify to him too, and you know my testimony is true. But again, he doesn't identify himself by name. So how do we know that the author of this epistle, how do we know that his testimony is true? Because we don't even know who he is, because he doesn't identify himself. The people that he's writing to, the people that would have received this letter, they would know who it's from. But how do we know who it's from? We need something outside of the scriptures. So when you read these epistles, as I read these epistles, I just keep coming back to, we need a church to tell us who wrote this, that St. John actually wrote this, and that it is inspired. But you need a church with true, authentic teaching authority that can bind you to such a thing, a church like we read about in the Gospels, in the book of Acts, in the other epistles. That's the church that we need. But like according to Protestantism, the church does not have that authority, or no particular Protestant church has that authority. Fascinating. Let's keep going. This is the end of this epistle. In verse 13, the final greeting, he says, again, the same thing. This is crazy. He says the same thing in 3 John 2. Now check this out. The same thing that he said in 2 John, he says it again in 3 John. He says this. He says, I had much to write to you, but I would rather not write with pen and ink. I hope to see you soon, and we will talk together face to face. So the exact same greeting that he gave in 2 John, he copied and pasted it for 3 John as well. And he says, peace be to you. The friends greet you. Greet the friends, every one of them. So vague. What is it that he had to tell this community that he's writing to? What is it that he had to tell Gaius, the beloved Gaius, that he didn't even bother to write down, that he wants to say face to face? Because if this epistle, these two epistles, they almost seem kind of like accidental, like they don't really need to be in the Bible, like they don't belong, but they're in the Bible. why are they in the Bible? And if what St. John had to write here in these two epistles, where he had a lot more to say, but he didn't bother to write it down, it seems like if you write from these epistles, like that what's really important, that what's really interesting is whatever it is that he had to tell them in person. What are those things that he had to tell them in person? See, if I were a Protestant reading these epistles, I would be very nervous and I'd be very worried because I would be asking myself these questions. I would say, it seems like we're missing things. It seems like there are things that the apostles were teaching that they didn't bother to write down, that they would rather tell people face to face. There are Protestants that say that the apostles were not authoritative in what they preached, only in what they wrote down. But again, St. John, his epistles, it seems like he puts more emphasis on what he didn't write, on what he wanted to say face to face. So these epistles are fascinating, and it just shows the need for a church to be able to fill in the gaps for us, to tell us what is not written down, and to even tell us that what is written down, that these two epistles belong in the Bible. Incredible. So, these were the two epistles of St. John, 2nd and 3rd John. We're going to go through 1st John, which is 5 chapters long, so we're going to do a whole video dedicated to that because there's so much in 1st John. That'll be the one that we do next. But again, thank you for joining me here on the second installment of this series. We just went through 2 books of the Bible. Make sure that you pick up this Ignatius Press Catholic Study Bible, and make sure that you like, share, and subscribe, and all that good stuff. We'll see you for the next installment. Glory to Jesus Christ.